So it's like traveling. If it is Tuesday, this must be Belgium. Remember that movie? So I think we're going to go, like I think in my next occupation, I want to be an auctioneer so I can talk fast, type thing. So, okay. But anyway, enough kidding apart type of thing. So, okay, this was a survey that I was planning to do, but I think, uh, okay, you can answer for yourself, type of thing. Are you religious? Okay, I think, and then are you spiritual? Okay, are you agnostic? Are you atheist? Okay, do you believe in soul? Okay, do you believe in mind-body dualism? Okay, do you believe that mind and brain are separate entity? So this kind of gives you a revision for what we talked about, in the last class, So I didn't have the enough Zoom savvy to create a poll like Rich Kennedy does, but one of these days I'll figure it out, type of thing. But it takes up a lot of time. You have to leave it up and that thing. So time is of the essence, So now I learned from, Gerald Still that I should go over what we discussed, and much to the chagrin of John, this is what we talked about, Plato's type trade. So, okay, and I think this is I don't know if I could zoom along type of thing, but these are some of the Greek words which I would refuse to pronounce, type of thing. But this is what we talked about for those who missed it or just type thing. So this was, and because it was, it came as a brainwave type of thing. So as it was mentioned in the brochure, I had to stick to it type of thing. But one thing we can say, well, we can rest, the soul can be rest in peace, so we can get back to real science type of thing, Okay, and then we talked about Descartes, type of thing. And Descartes, being a man, did not listen to women. There were two women who challenged him, said, what you're saying does not jibe. An English woman named Margaret Cavendish, and another was a Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. But so he still stuck to it, and that idea of mind-body dualism, continued, and it still continues in common language type of thing. And then we talked about the state of possible minds type of things, the structure of possible minds. And this goes down to a book that written by an English writer named Philip Ball, who's kind of writes on varieties of subjects type thing, and it's about the origin of mind. And I will send out a link type thing, and those of you who want to read, and these are some of his slides about the Mind Club. So we talked about how the overlap between intelligence and agency. But underneath that, the cornerstone of all still remains, evolution. And so that's the point that we want to emphasize type thing. So this is what we have basically talked about type of thing, And now this is, it's always good to start with this, Okay, now this is, I think that there's, okay, now not Bruce or the computer people, but does everybody know what a CAPTCHA stands for? Okay, anybody who's a non-computer scientist can talk about what the word CAPTCHA, CAPTCHA, stand for. Okay, Bruce, do you know what that stands for?
I know it's an acronym, but I can't remember it.
Okay, yeah, all right, yeah, I just ran across it. Completely automated public Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. Okay, that's it. I just learned this within last few days, type of thing. It was in one of the computer magazines that the test is that this will be judged by a computer, but the tragedy is when you actually fail it, Okay, so this was, and now why is that? Why am I stepping on Bruce's, stealing on Bruce's thunder? Because obviously, now the Turing is, I'm sure all of you or most of you know, and those of you who do not know who Turing or what Turing was, I would strongly recommend that if you haven't seen Imitation Game, okay, the movie, see it before Bruce starts next week after next, okay? So that'll give you a running start type thing. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning is because he was, like there are very few polymaths in 20th century, but he surely was. And this is the reason why I'm mentioning it, because this may be Even Bruce May, I don't know if he knows that, but he actually talked about the chemical basis of morphogenesis. And morphogenesis means, evolution of human body parts or, various animal this thing. So he really uh, eh, had some thoughts that he shared on, so this was, I mean, the writing may be hard to see, but this was published, back in the 1950s. So this is one of the things. And this is so basically what we talks about, as to how we have both the disciplines are incorporated. We have put the soul to rest. We talked about mind. Well, today we'll focus about brain, and then that channels into talking about computers. And I will, but I won't touch on the computer part, but we'll, as much time permits, we'll talk about the brain computer interfaces. But again, things are not, and in fact, it's almost like everything is interconnected. Mind, brain, and body are interconnected, and you can just see that. And the word here is important on the left side is evolve. So the underlying the basis of all this is still stands evolution. Okay. And then again, so the diversity of the behavior is a complex interplay of all three or four factors: the mind, brain, body, and evolution. Okay, and obviously it goes to without to say that the so-called not just Darwinian evolution, but so-called neo-Darwinism, which goes down to the discovery of genes and you know and the 1953 breakthrough of a structure of DNA. So it boils down to so. And now again, again, but the whole thing is like we may think that yes, everything we can deduce by reductionism, but not. We're going to learn eventually that not all problems are computable type thing, and in spite of what computer scientists and artificial intelligence people are saying. So we may still run into limits of knowledge, as we talked about, when we talked about Heisenberg uh, uncertainty principle that is in physics. So we may still run into this. And okay, so and again, this we'll talk about how the brain interprets some of this thing that creates things. So, and some of the axioms that are outlined in the green slide. No, it's a biological organ, and when you talk about the number of permutations and combination as to 80 billion neurons, and each one has 1,000 synapses, the possibilities became uh, enormous. And somewhere along the line, we're going to run into the limits of energy and heat, because I think it's going to be difficult to uh, duplicate what nature has taken millions of years to evolve, to duplicate, type thing. So we may run into the limits of science type of thing. So, and the interplay of this and the factors that led to all this evaluation as to why did all this happen type thing. A lot of that may be social need, because we are partly evolved from chimps. So it may be have to do with our social need or group behavior or troop behavior, as we'd call it, Okay. And obviously reproduction being the biggest thing. And last but not the least, language has a dramatic impact, and culture. So all these factors had a lot to do with how we became so clever. Again, to see how smart I am, and this goes down to, dealing with increasingly complex word type thing. And there is something called the Flynn effect, that with group behavior, we got a little smarter. And the language has dramatic impact. And that may explain why American women love British accent, type thing. You can sell anything with a Brit accent type thing. So, and again, how does the brain work? We'll just summarize, uh, you know, we'll elaborate more in details. But brain makes decision based on internal representation, okay, of that the brain generates type of thing. And the processing that goes down is not just like a basic pinhole camera, like from outside in, but it's top-down processing that takes. And I'll have several examples of it as we go along. And it goes down to the concept of early days of statistics as to what the current thinking on consciousness in neuroscience would tell about something called the Bayesian uh, inference. Okay, and those of you who remember your statistics class, would remember that Bayes theorem, that was the founding of early or of statistics as we came to know it. Okay. Now again, this again emphasizes the mind-brain-body relationship that not only applies in human beings or mammals, but this is mind-boggling when you come to think about it, as to how, you know, uh, from uh, a worm to morphos into butterflies, from pupa to testing how caterpillar turns into, a butterfly. And again, the whole body form is changed as to how the memories are still retained in spite of radical brain reconstruction. And and, and some of the stuff, there is a guy at Tufts named Michael Levine, and he has done a lot of work on, the memory and intelligence, along with emphasis on regenerative medicine. And so this is one of his slides as to how. Okay, let's see if I can zoom in further.
Hey,
Okay.
Bharat,
Yes. Uh-huh.
uh,
Yeah.
that kind of parallels our sense of smell, doesn't it?
Yes, it has to do with pheromones and chemical basis. So this is, like, and we'll talk about how this thing is like, and it again, I gave you, if you recall from last time, we gave you an example of termite mound and colony of ants as to
Okay.
how it just
Okay.
evolves. And so we'll talk about how uh, the input, how the brain transmits, shares information between various synapses. So we're getting into that. And if I don't know if everybody had the time to send out the first intro video that I had sent from my old lecture. It talks about the basics of anatomy and physiology type of thing. So, and and I was looking at my old lecture, and actually I thought the old lecture was nicer than the present one, because these subjects are more complicated and controversial. For example, talking about what mind is, or consciousness is, or free will is, because even the experts don't have any, real testing. But when you talk about the basic anatomy and physiology, we have a lot more, or senses, for example, or science of sleep. Okay, we have a lot more concrete information. So we are on more solid ground when we talk about the subjects that we have more solid information. Okay, that's how. Okay. And now, again, one thing we did not talk about, and very lot of these things does not talk about, is how we get energy, and this goes down to the classic depiction of Ben Franklin, bringing down electricity, so that's, and so when we talk about how, how the impulses, now recently there have been a lot of popular books written about the role of bioelectricity in, just in various parts of human body and various animal cognition. So these are, so a role of electricity is coming to, starting from, the simple eel that shocked, so it goes back to the days of Greece, when they realized that there are some fish that could shock the dickens out of you, type of thing. And so this was well known for 2,000 years. But finally, for every system, because basically we are a closed system. Our body is like a closed system when we communicate with the external world. And to maintain our internal milieu, or the word to quote the famous physiologist Claude Bernard, is called homeostasis. Okay, we need energy. So this is where varieties of energy forms comes around. And again, this, I was thinking about that. It goes down to the early days of Greek thought. When initially for sailing we used wind as energy, then we used coal, and then we used electricity. So this is, so it comes down to that the same energy source is available. And obviously, I think just goes to show as to how some of the early experiments of electricity inspired the idea of Frankenstein, the famous novel, that thing. And again, electricity got a bad rep from the movie as to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Okay, but that again, the work that some of the work that is done in bioelectricity is dramatically impressive as to how just changing the bioelectric currents of various stem cells, they can see that Michael Levine's work, they can grow a frog with 5 legs or put an eye on a leg type thing. So some of the work that is done with synthetic bioenergy and regenerative medicine is either it's groundbreaking or Frankensteinian, so that you can make your own decision based on that. So how the morphogenesis gradient is changed by manipulating the cellular electrical current is a very cutting edge research that is done in the field of regenerative medicine. Okay, let's see. I think I should probably look at. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, so now I was just looking over the chat type things. Okay. All right. So, okay. No, so it was not a question, just a comment primarily. So this is what this does about, okay, moving forward, this is what I think we were referring to as to in the early days of neuroscience, that some of you who remember the reading from Matthew Cobb's book, the video that I had sent out, and the early days of neurology or neuroscience, the controversy was as to what was most important, either the chemicals or electricity, okay? And it was cleverly labeled as soups or cables, And some of the words are well known to all of us, This is a repeat slide, but it is important point, so I'm repeating that. These are well known to all of us, adrenaline, dopamine, the selective SSRIs, the antidepressants, and again, the workhorse of neurotransmission called acetylcholine, okay, and the GABA, which has a lot to do with anesthesia, and endorphins, which makes us the happiest thing. So, and the neurotransmission, this is like a GIF image of how the slow transmission occurs, and when the nerve fiber is covered with myelin sheath, which is like the fatty layer, so the transmission is faster. Okay. Now, this again, this goes down to more modern research as to how the voltage can affect the for individual cell level as to how the change of ion current inside a single cell can affect, the transduction. These are the varieties of genetic terms, that those of you who took John Hassel's class would remember the classic principle of genes to proteins, the basic genetic principle. So that can be controlled by electrical flow. So the ion channel work is very cutting edge, basically. So basically, you are basically, when you think about it, your body is basically a hollow tube, okay? And it is connected to varieties of internal bacteria and trillions of cells. So you're interconnected with the outside world. So the way the one can interpret the so-called ion channels, where sodium and potassium rush into the cell, and so that's the way the cell communicates with the outside, and that again, uh, translates into computer science. That is how the information flow occurs. The body communicates, the individual cell communicates with the neighboring cell, and the whole mixture of cells communicates with the organ, and we communicate with the outside. So this is how we are interconnected with the outside world, basically. And again, this is not just academic exercise, but has a dramatic relay in diseases such as Parkinson's disease, immunity, and the role of inflammation. So this has very practical significance, I think, as to how the gut bacteria may have influences on your body metabolism, and even causing, varieties of diseases such as Parkinsonism and affecting our immunity. Okay, so this just emphasizes, and I think I probably had a slide in my earlier demonstration of the autonomic nervous system, because the nervous system has two parts, the central, which is our skull. On the other hand, the peripheral nervous system, which is the so-called autonomic nervous system, as to how the brain communicates with the rest of the body. So the point that I want to emphasize is the interconnectedness of the body to the mind and brain. Okay. And again, so this gives us a chance into, we didn't elaborate into so-called theory of mind, which is how the mind or the process evolved, basically. So and this work basically was done in the 70s type thing as to how finally, and to go back to evolution of theory of mind, we go back to the earliest days of human evolution. We go back to studying babies and children as to how the mind evolves. And so this has to be, and this is how the process evolved. And some of the basic principles, I'm repeating myself as to how it evolved in order to learn what other people are doing, because again, that helps us navigate a social life as well as interpret other people's actions. Okay, and so and again, uh, so the way the mind evolves is to the varieties of two things. First, we have a belief that causes intention and that leads to action. Okay, so this is, and so some of the mental representations that occur in our mind that helps us as as evolving animals to compete with others, to cooperate with others, and to coordinate varieties of activities that goes along. So this is, and that leads us to rational action that leads to our survival and gives us the benefit of reproduction. Okay, so this is basically, so now this has been localized to various areas of brain. So the idea being how to collect our thought processes or mind with the anatomical structure of brain. So this has been localized to an area which is, called right temporoparietal junction. Okay, so this has been localized with the recent data on functional and MRI this thing. So some of the studies that were done were in children as to this takes time to develop, basically. I'm sorry, I went back. Okay, and it develops usually around age of 3 to 4, I think. And this is where the difference comes in, that that the testing that is done for theory of mind, the kids who fail are, are on autism spectrum. Okay, so this helps us with early diagnosis, of autistic, behavior that is likely to develop, and that may give people tool to intervene at an earlier stage. Okay, and this lets me to digress that UK had a big project of based on a 10,000 genome analysis to do something called polygenic score and trying to diagnose autistic uh, tendencies at a young age. And this was a major project that was being undertaken with the collaboration of University of Cambridge and University College of London. But unfortunately, with the protest from the autistic community, the whole idea just basically fall apart because they did not take the general public into confidence. So that has been shelved for the time being. Okay, so this is, and and again, the theory of mind is not entirely dependent upon language skills alone, because when people did studies on deaf kids, in deaf colonies and in an area on Nicaragua, where the studies were done, this theory of mind had developed totally on its own. So it wasn't entirely dependent upon language skills. Okay, and this is just to say as to how neuroscience, or now it is called as cognitive science, evolved. Okay, this is a rather very busy slide, but just tells you an idea as to how we went around from the early days of psychology and the early days of electricity, Helmholtz current, okay, to the Paulo and the rise of behaviorism, okay, and going back further into, you know, uh, into the origin of genetics and and then varieties of other things as to over time. So, and finally, we are getting into the end about uh, cognitive science evolved and got into multidisciplinary involvement of not just philosophy, but anthropology, evolution, genetics, and really to the discipline that we now call, and along with the parallel rise of computer science, and and again some of the other things that are going. I think I'll leave it to Bruce to talk about, some of the uh, uh, advances that have occurred in artificial intelligence. So this is the timeline of computer science that we talked about. The setback that occurred was with the behaviorism, where we thought everything was, like a blank slate, and so the science was, kind of frozen. And similarly, again, this outlines how starting from 2000 plus years ago, from Searle to Descartes to Darwin to cell theory to the false start that we had of phrenology, okay, that recognizing brain by feeling variants of skull, to Ramonica Cajal, which we'll talk a little bit about, to the so-called Penfield maps, through CT scan to MRI, to the workhorse of the present day of computer functional MRI scan. Okay, and just to say that there was also something called computational theory of mind, which I won't get too much into it, but I think Bruce will talk a lot about these two names, which may not be familiar to all of you. So I will leave it to him, to McCulloch and Pitts. But a philosopher named Hilary Putnam, who is a Brit, who tried to put this, combine things together as to computational theory of mind, interpreting mind as a so-called wetware or software of the heart, and brain as hardware. Okay, and early days of in the neuroscience, a British neuroscientist named David Marr, who did a lot of work on the neuroscience of vision, and so he had a lot more to do with it, work type thing, and he had proposed some of the earlier work as far back in the 70s. Last but not the least, Steven Pinker has done work on language instinct, that some of you may have read the book type thing, as uh, to how the brain is evolved. And along, he's on the same page as Noam Chomsky as to proposing something known as universal grammar, okay, which we are hardwired for. And some of those ideas are coming into question with the recent advances in artificial intelligence. So there has been interplay between computer science and neuroscience, going back to almost in the 60s, but it's come to the more to the front in recent years. Okay. And again, this is some of it, I will leave it to Bruce, that, some of the computer science people, their terminology is different as to working with various data and various mental representation, and leading to the process of thinking. Okay, so you can just show how these two disciplines are interconnected. And okay, but again, there's a big problem. This joke was a worthwhile type of thing as to how we run into the limitations, that the hard things are easy, but easy things are difficult. Okay, that's what the computer science says. Like, so the joke is pretty apparent type of thing. You could read it type of figures too, because they had eggs, so. And there are some other examples that we'll talk about as to how it is going to be, the problem of creating intelligence is going to be harder than we think. Okay, so so we still have, so stop worrying about it. Okay, and again, now getting back to a little bit more details about, there is a, as to how the theory of mind evolved, as to goes back to the early days of research on theory of mind, as to how, then this cartoon may be harder to read the small print, so I wrote down. Okay, the Sally and Ann type thing, has a basket and has a box. Puts a marble in a basket, goes walking and moves the marble. When Sally comes back, where does she look for it? Okay, so this is the called classic psychological testing called the Sally and Ann test. So this was given to kids, a 3- and 4-year-olds type of thing. And again, so this, where we talked about, 3 and 4-year-olds, type of thing, so this, where we talked about, 3 and 4-year-olds, type of thing. And again, so this, where we talked about, 3 and 4-year-olds, type of thing. And again, so this, where we talked about the autistic kids type thing. And so the difference takes place. For the sake of time, I eliminated the video, but this basically outlines the same thing as to how a child minds evolve between 3 and 4. Okay. And this is the article in New York Times that GPT-4. Now, I had to look up what GPT-4 is. By the way, I think, I'm sure Bruce will talk more about it. It's the abbreviation stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, whatever that is. So I will skip that. Similar test. Now, this is not a unique human property. This test was given for the chimps also, and they can also sometimes pass some of these tests. So can other apes, bonobos, and orangutans can also participate in the false belief type of test. On the other hand, gorillas, they fail the test. So it's an interesting testing. So, okay. And again, similarly, on March 22nd, a research team from Microsoft has shown that they can pass that the software can pass this Sally and Ann test. So it's so suggesting that the software has an advanced level of theory of minds, so to speak. So, okay. But again, their accuracy was not so great. It was like 59%. So they have a long way to catch up, basically. Okay, now this is worthwhile in playing the video even though it's only about a 5-minute video, called Theory of Mind and 4E Cognition. So what 4E stands for, I'll let the video speak for itself.
In the classic movie Frankenstein, Dr. Victor Frankenstein makes a new person from parts of deceased people. He sends his assistant Fritz to the University Museum to steal a normal brain in a jar. Fritz accidentally brings back the brain of a criminal. That makes the Frankenstein monster bad. The assumption in this movie is that you are your brain. We could call this the Frankenstein hypothesis. This hypothesis seems to be the assumption underlying many physicalist theories. The identity theory, functionalism, and connectionism are brain-centric theories. Brain-centric theories ignore the role that the body and the environment play when it comes to determining mental states. According to some philosophers, we must see that the mind is embodied and embedded. In other words, we are not brains in vats. We can show that we are not just brains in vats by giving examples in which cognition or experiences are embodied and embedded. When we say that cognitive states, such as the concepts we have, are embodied, we mean that the cognitive states of an organism are determined or at least strongly influenced by the type of body that the organism has. Imagine that an organism is perfectly spherical and has eyes on all sides. Would it then have concepts, such as front and back? This is not very likely, because the organism has no front and no back. So, here you can clearly see that concepts are embodied. That cognitive states are embedded means that the cognitive states of an organism are determined or at least strongly influenced by the type of the environment the organism lives in. If people want to build a very large building, then they need all kinds of building plans to be able to think ahead about how they're going to tackle that. Termites build termite mounds with no building plans, which is comparable to humans trying to build a gigantic flat without any blueprints. The prevailing idea is that the environment actually indicates what they should do. Thus, as a result and without further thought, the termite mound gets built. Termites create those mounds out of mud balls made with their own saliva. There are certain kind of chemicals in that saliva. If a termite leaves one of those mud balls somewhere, then part of the environment will contain those chemicals as a result. If other termites came across those chemicals and had a mud ball with them, they would place it on top of the other mud ball. In this way, columns and arches are created which form the basic structure of a termite mound. They do not have to make an entire building plan in advance to be able to build the mound, as long as they have an environment containing the right signals. Not only is cognition embodied and embedded, experiences are as well. That experiences, such as the experiences of blue and green, are embodied means that the experiences of an organism are determined or at least strongly influenced by the type of body that organism has. A bit of a tongue-in-cheek example is the following. In the United States, serial killer Arthur Shawcross was convicted in 1990. Everything was wrong with this man. One of the things wrong with him was that he had an elevated level of cryptopyrrole, a chemical that is released by the liver during the breakdown of red blood cells. That chemical has the same effect as LSD, which causes strong visual hallucinations in most people who use it. It is unclear whether this caused Shawcross' terrible behavior. What matters now is the Frankenstein hypothesis. What if the Frankenstein monster had gotten a normal brain, but a liver like the one of Shawcross? Wouldn't that have been an equally decisive factor for his behavior? Clearly, other parts of the body besides the brain can determine what people experience. That experiences are embedded means that the experiences of an organism are determined or at least strongly influenced by the type of environment the organism lives in. There is an example that shows that this concerns colors and color experiences. As the philosopher John Locke claimed, colors are secondary qualities, qualities that we attribute to things, but that the things do not have independently of us. Color experiences, of course, exist. Those color experiences depend on the environment in which one is situated. If we take a square that we experience as orange, and we move that square into a different environment, then of course that square itself does not change. But if the environment has other properties than the environment where the square came from, you can experience it as a different color, such as brown. This demonstrates that the environment partly determines the experience. From a Darwinian perspective, the idea that mental states are embodied and embedded is not at all innovative, because anyone who thinks from an evolutionary standpoint knows that organisms have evolved as a whole and are adapted to their natural environment. Naturally, all proponents of the various physicalist theories know that the mind being embodied and embedded is in fact only an elaboration of what all physicalists have believed all along. It is therefore not a criticism that refutes one or more of these theories, it is an extension of physicalism in general.
Okay, so it was a very nice video. I think it was worth our time to spend on. And if does anybody have any comments or questions? Okay.
Just
And
one comment.
yes,
Just
please
one
go ahead.
comment about the termites and the collective intelligence or consciousness or whatever. Lewis Thomas wrote some wonderful essays about that, if anybody cares.
Mhm. It's, and this is, we don't have as much time, but we'll talk about, this is something to do with ant colonies, as to how they work. And there are concepts which are called a feed forward or feed backward loops type of thing as to how, for example, one ant finds food and the other ants just follow the smell type of thing. And when they're going backward, the smell actually decreases. So that's how the backward loop comes around. So that way all the ants just don't go towards the food, but that it kind of disperses. So this is how collective intelligence forms type of thing, because in the brochure we're going to talk about collective intelligence. So this is one of the examples as to how it's a self-limiting structure as to feed forward loops and feed backward loops, and the same thing occurs inside the cell also as to how the loops again control the behavior and try to maintain the ideal what is called homeostasis, and obviously I'm not going to get into some of the complex mathematical models that have been created. Okay. Now, again, the baseline structure of all this is neuron, and so this was determined, by the advent of microscopy and the staining. This was determined, as far back as 150 plus years ago, by a German anatomist named Joseph Gerlach, who discovered, the network of neurons, I think, and we again, Matthew Kolb illustrates in his book about how the controversy continued between the two people in the early days of neuroscience, between Volta and Golgi, who discovered the stain, as to even though these two Nobel laureates, even at the last time, they were still arguing as to who was correct, as to how the network is formed as to individual neurons, as to there is all continuation. So that's now again, this is a very important concept to go that Okay, so you are basically a continuum that underlying basically, starting from atoms to uh, molecules. Sorry, if I can zoom in as uh, to starting out to unicellular organisms to all through the evolutionary tree. So you're basically the evolution has, you cannot, uh, exclude the role that the evolution has played in terms of forming mind and body, collaboration and the present day brain. Okay, so the individual uh, neurons, basically they work in collaboration, as we talked about, as to how they're interconnected. Okay, and so and again, at the same time, we already had mentioned as to how neurons need the energy, which we talked about as to how, even though the brain is only, 2 or 3% of or 1% of your body, it consumes 20% of your energy, type of thing. So it's a big energy hog. Uh, so then, and that again explains as to how the extreme evolution of our uh, neocortex that has taken place that gives us into cognition, and that may have something to do with the evolution of consciousness as we came to know it. Okay, so again, finally, the continuation is to be need to be emphasized, and this has a lot to do with the ossification of our skull, as to how this little diagram shows as to how the brain skull expansion has controlled, and there is a concept that was called something called the encephalization quotient. But that means as to how our brain size relates to our body size, And varieties of animals are placed on this descending graph type of thing as to how, for example, a rabbit has an encephalization quotient of 0.4, okay? While at the same time, you can see humans are way out here, okay, as to 7.7, okay? Obviously, the whales are bigger, but their body size is a lot bigger. So you can see as to how the bigger brain size that has evolved with the more availability of energy has a lot to do with our intelligence, consciousness, and all the other what we can call as emergent phenomenon or epiphenomenon that have arisen with passage of billions of years. Okay, okay. So this is an interesting depiction as to how the brain size has a lot to do with our properties, that the higher function properties that we're dealing with. Okay. Now, how do we study brain? And this goes back to the early days of anatomists, to microscopy, to the early days of when we discovered the role of electricity, of a guy named Hans Berger, and I think, Peter probably knows more about EEG than I ever will, type of thing. Okay, working with neurology, I think. And so this was the early days of EEG with Hans Berger, but as you can see, as like everything else, process has evolved dramatically. Now you can have 128 channel skull cap, with recording much more precise. And this was the early days of diagnosis, and that was the fundamental of diagnosis of, the brain disorder, with very common brain disorder of epilepsy. Okay, and this again led into the further investigation of sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. So this is, this was the early days of venturing into the exploring the properties of mind. And this has been fairly well localized, as this more recent diagram is to shows as to how the varieties of brain waves have localization with varieties of cognitive function. I think that during the sleep or even meditation, the so-called theta waves, are more prominent. So this, so there are, it's that this was one of the first starting points of investigating brain as we got to know it. Okay, and this, then again, our tools have expanded, starting from the early days, that the next game will go from right to left with the in the 60s, late 60s, CT scanning became available, then positive emission tomography became available, and last but not the least, the MRI scan, which has revolutionized, the investigation of brain. Okay, and this is MRI scan is as a was a very complicated development, and as many as 6 Nobel Prizes have been given for a development of, and the name was changed to remove the bad connotation of nuclear as to nuclear magnetic resonance from to magnetic resonance imaging. And this is a static picture. On the other hand, this is more of a dynamic picture. You can see how the brain moves with each and every pulsation. So connection, and the upper diagram is the so-called functional MRI as to how the metabolic process of brain, and based on the glucose consumption is investigated. This is the basic workhorse of neuroscience as it is right now. Okay. Okay. So now again, how much we have learned, and these are the various so-called NCC. What NCC means, neural coordinates of consciousness. So finally, we have succeeded in localizing varieties of parts, and I have about half a dozen slides to talk about how we learned. Now this was again known from the early days of people with stroke and brain trauma, but with fMRIs, we've been able to localize far more precisely. And the early days, it was known as to how the so-called motor area and the sensory areas, these were well known in the early days. And then later on, based on patient analogy, we're able to diagnose where speech evolves as the so-called Broca's area. And this, again, we learned from patients who have had strokes and damages. So this goes back to the early days of clinical science, as to varieties of areas have been localized. And so again, and some of the other areas we have learned it from, again, from stroke victims as well as from neuroscience. So this elaborates, in a more broader picture as to how we've come to localize where the different thought processes and cognitive processes are localized in human brain. Okay. And again, we are, as human beings, we are visual creatures. And the vision and interpretation of vision occupies a very large area of our brain, not only in the occipital or the back part of the brain, but also in the other areas of higher visual areas. Okay. And you can see how this was one of the slides. There's a well-known researcher in Dr. Livingston at MIT. This is one of her slides as to how the image comes in from retina, goes to the brainstem, and the two primary visual cortex. And so the two streams are what means object recognition, face recognition, color, and to interpret where it occurs. So how, and now the processing, which it's not like from outside in, but it occurs from brain interprets the images. Now, I did a class on senses at one time, and I have several slides of that. If anybody's interested, I'll be glad to share it with you as to how the top-down processing occurs and as to how our vision can mislead us. And I'll have some examples of it as we go along. Okay. Now, this is how the varieties of areas are localized. It just gives you a rough idea of how our senses are interpreted in different, the stimulus comes in, and as to how the touch is interpreted in something called somatosensory cortex. Visual cortex is in the back. The sound is in the auditory cortex, which is over the temporal or the side region. Smell is a direct pathway to the brain and olfactory cortex. And taste, there are varieties of center. Taste and smell are very interconnected. Balance is in the cerebellum, which is the so-called little part. Last but not the least, our memory is located in the area called hippocampus, which looks like a little like a seahorse. So, okay. Now, again, but this is an interesting slide, which was, for example, for memory. Okay. How quickly can you memorize this 10 words? Okay. Okay. If you ask, this is something called the, short-term memory. If I ask you to memorize these letters, you'll be able to memorize up to 7. But as you try to memorize the last, the 8, 9, and 10, you are most likely going to forget this first 3. Okay. And this may explain why the phone numbers are 7 digits. Okay, so that's the short-term memory type thing. Now, at the same time, if I organize this words, you can see this say the words. Okay, this you'll remember fairly easily because there is a pattern that forms. Okay, so this is an example as to how our memory is formed, as to how we see the context and how the words are interpreted type thing, because that is non-random, you'll have difficulty recognizing basically or memorizing. Okay, so and now again I said I'll give you a slide about the illusions. Okay, can anybody tell what's in this image? Not really, it's just black and white blobs, right? Now you can see it as to how, the brain, forms, once you see this, you're able to say, oh yeah, here it is, here is her eye, here's the horse, So there are varieties of optical illusion as to how the brain fills in the details. Okay, so so it's like the top-down processing that takes place. Okay, and so this is something called the mind's eye, basically type of thing. So, and there are a few years ago there was one of these things that this may be worthwhile playing.
Yummy. 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 Yummy.
Okay, so this was interesting as to how auditory wise you can be fooled, basically type of thing. Also, this was a few years ago. This was a very popular video about how the two words as to how the higher frequency was to when it's toned down, was laurel. So how we understand various speech recognition, this has a lot to do with our frequency and the amplitude of the sound that occurs. And if you get conflicting information, that again depends upon the individual speakers as to, I don't know how many of you interpreted that as Yanni and how many of you interpreted as Laurel. So that it shows about how the auditory processing occurs based on the individual preferences.
Yummy.
Okay, now this rather busy slides, that talks about how this is a lot more detailed example as to how the varieties of sophisticated cognitive processes occurs, and the two mains that I outlined in red are the prefrontal cortex. Okay, this is the right area, which is like the workhorse of all the processing that takes place, as to how it controls our behavior, and okay, and the varieties of information processing, understanding of ourself and non-self, or perception. And so this is the main work parts area. This is the special privilege of mammals or humans, basically. And there are varieties of areas which have a lot to do with face recognition. And last but not the least, the early part that is evolved is the so-called part of our limbic system, which is the amygdala, okay, which has to do with our, the 3F or so-called 4F response, okay, which is fight, flight, feeding, and fornicating. Okay, so this is the 4F response, that has a lot to do with an area called amygdala. Okay, and all the emotional responses that takes place, type of thing. These are in the small area, which is the almond-shaped organ, which is related in the brain, the midbrain part, or thalamus. Okay, and so this is how varieties of recognition takes place. So this is the so-called neural coordinates of consciousness. Okay. Okay. Again, we are talking a class on ethics, and we talked about the difference of empathy and compassion, and the varieties of areas of empathy and compassion are recognized in different locations, type of thing. So this is, okay. Okay, it's interpersonal relationship, and compassion is actually taking an action for it. Then these are the areas that are involved. Let me see if I can zoom in. Okay, yeah. So these are the key brain areas. Again, the prefrontal cortex, temporoparietal junction, and the temporal region. And there is an area of the brain called the cingulate cortex. These are all involved in process of empathy and compassion. Now, again, this is not a unique human phenomenon.
Franz began the fairness test with the capuchin monkey. These small, clever animals are kept in large enclosures, but for the short duration of the test, they're brought into a lab. Each monkey carries out a simple task, and when both get a reward of a cucumber, everyone's happy. But watch what happens when the one on the right receives a grape instead.
Oh. Wait a minute.
Grapes are so much better than cucumber, and the one who gets cucumber gets really emotionally upset by the fact that the other one is getting grapes.
Somehow, sorry, but I think the video does not play. I only got the sound part.
In chimpanzees, things go actually a little bit further and gets very close to the human sense of fairness, in that the one who gets grapes also gets upset sometimes, and the one who gets grapes sometimes waits till the other one also gets a grape. So that gets very close to the human sense of fairness.
So the one that's getting the better reward refuses to take the reward until the other animal is being similarly rewarded with the good stuff.
Yeah, that's in chimpanzees. That has never been found in another animal, but the chimpanzee goes much further in that they care about reward division even if they're on the better end of the scale.
Okay, so that shows that it's not a unique human property. So I'm sorry, somehow the image should play, but I think I must have just downloaded the sound pattern rather than this thing. So, but you get the idea type of thing as to how it has evolved on evolutionary scale over millions of years. Okay, let's see what else. Who has in the Jerry in here? Oh, Jerry. Okay, yeah. So people have commented about how. Okay, and at the same time, we've taken advantage of mind control that goes back to the early days of CIA, varieties of mind control, device type things. So, and along with insulin coma and the varieties of drugs, and there was the early days of LSD experiment, and even recently there will be some controversy about the people who had some problems with their thinking when at the part of Cuban embassy, and the Chinese have this thing. Have been accused of getting Ogier. So varieties of methods as to how mind control has been exercised type of thing. Okay. And obviously, you may remember the movie, The Manchurian Candidate. So, and this, again, the process goes down as to how recently the psychedelics have been beginning to the vogue as to how the mind expanding behavior, as to how we can dissolve the idea of self with psychedelic drugs. And some of you if you wanted to see a movie that was based, this is a movie that was made back in, I want to say in the 80s, something called Altered States. Okay. And that there's a scientist who actually takes the mind altering drugs in, amongst the Native Indians, and goes through the all evolutionary thinking as to how his personality dissolves. So it was an interesting movie type of thing as to how. And so a lot of stuff has been written about, and the popular writer Michael Fullan has written a book about his own experience at age 45 or 50 about taking mind expanding drug and his experiences. And that's coming into the vogue of so-called microdosing as to how to enhance our creativity. Okay, so that's coming into the vogue. So the psychedelics, and they're finding a role in terms of treating, post-traumatic stress disorders, and so that is, coming into the existence, and we may hear a lot more about it, and so how whether this drug or psilocybin and other, so this goes back to the early days of human evolution, that how the shamans were using some of this mind expanding drug and creating some of the visions. and may have a lot to do with our ideas, okay, that has formed. Okay, so I think we're coming up to 1 hour. We have gone over about 25 slides. We should take a few minutes break and then continue with more interesting material. Okay, I think if you wouldn't mind pausing the recording, Bruce, please, and then we can join back. It's 11 o'clock and we'll join in few, please. Yeah, or I can start, yeah. Okay, all right, start, no, Paul, oh, okay. I think Bruce may have, yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so I've done about 25 slides. Now, I think this is an interesting video that there is no way I can show out, but he's an English researcher, psychologist, neuroscientist, whatever you want to call it, named Humphrey, and this was his recent talk, and there's no way I can show the whole video, but it's absolutely worth your time. And I'll go to the time where he shows about the animal intelligence. Let me see if I can go to
of the light arriving at his eye.
Okay, I'll go to what I wanted to show type of thing, but it's a very worthwhile video watching type of thing, and it may be worth time for those of you who are interested. I'll go to 36 minutes. Sorry.
So where should we be looking? I've been arguing that phenomenal consciousness gives an animal a competitive advantage specifically because of its psychological effects. The way it changes how the animal thinks. Firstly, about what it's like to be me, and secondly, about what it's like to be you. In my new book, Sentience, the Invention of Consciousness, I propose a variety of ways in which this is likely to show up in behavior. I ask, do animals have a robust sense of self centered on sensory experience? Do they engage in self-pleasuring activities, sensations for sensation's sake? Do they have notions of I and you as mirror selves? Can they carry their sense of their own identity forward? Can they, this is crucial, lend out their minds so as to understand another's feelings? Well, there's no time to expand on this now in this talk, but to whet your appetite, I'll show you some film clips that bear on the evidence which I discuss in the book. So it's rather just a random selection which I took off YouTube last week. You've all probably seen many similar things, but I want to draw your attention to what they're showing. So here, to start with, is a chimpanzee exploring his body as seen in a mirror. I believe he doesn't have a sense of self founded on bodily sensations. Here are some swans going for a dry ride. Pure sensation seeking is what's he. The great object of life, Lord Byron said, is sensation, to feel that we exist. And swans seem to be doing the same thing. Oh, here's a dog, in fact, doing something similar. And I won't show you, but he takes it up again and again and again. Here's an example of elephants showing sympathy, showing empathy, I should say, for another infant in trouble. Panic. They were putting themselves in the infant's place and knew what had to be done. And here, for good measure, is a film of a boy doing just the same. sentient beings can't but put ourselves in the place of suffering animals. And here are magpies bewailing a dead companion, puzzling about where that self has gone to.
Okay, so I think that was about it. But it's a worthwhile listening type thing. So, and obviously, it's instead of reading the book, I think his talk may be worthwhile. I think if you have any interest type thing. So this is a sensation which is a German word called Umwelt, which has to do with how the sensation of occurs in various animals depending upon their behavior. And for example, the same way for bats have a different way of getting to the thing called echolocation, and the birds, the tool behavior that we talked about, that thing. So this is, and again, we can talk up for hours on octopi, I think. So this is, and I'm sure we read the book in one of the things about the mind of an octopus. So that's a different evolutionary scale because they don't have, they have their neurons and there's no central organ such as brain. So that talks about how so one can say, rephrase Descartes' famous phrase as to I feel, therefore I am. And so it's not just a uniquely human privilege. Okay. But again, there are limits of science, type thing. And this goes back to, this was, I think, I don't know if Bruce is going to show this slide or not, but I think, it's like, it kind of, again, it's an overlap type of thing. Goes back to the early days of, goes back 400 years, 1613. There was a poet named Richard Braithwaite, had written a book. I have read The Truest Computer of Times, that thing, ignoramus et igno remibus. We do not know to what we shall not know type thing. So these are the limits of science as we talked about type thing. So, and so this gave the Latin maximum, which translates into we do not know and we will not know type thing. The idea that scientific knowledge is limited. This was popularized by a German physiologist, back in 1872. Okay, and so knowledge is power, and 20th century Hilbert, okay, and then again, goes back to the early days of mathematics. We must know certain things. So this is where we're letting into the limits of knowledge, I think, as to brain and computer interface. So how it shall all pan out, time will tell. And so this is Hilbert, was the great mathematician, his translation. And again, then that's just to introduce what Bruce will address in a lot more details, I'm sure. It's about the interface between the brain and the computer, and I'll go into it next week type thing. So again, between analog versus digital comparison. So for sake of time, I'm eliminating some of the slides type thing. And again, this is how we will not reach the limit. Okay, these are some interesting plates about, the whole talk is about computation, is cognition. Okay, but I'll jump to the point which I wanted to show to you, which is interesting. This is a lot more technical talk, but I think I want to go to 19 minutes and 23 seconds. Okay, now let's play it.
Objects like this and agents that pursue goals in the world. Okay, we can talk about that, talk about modeling that, as well as quantum mechanics and the origin of the universe and the origin of life and metaphysics and so many other topics. But in some sense, this is where it starts. Okay, so to get a little bit more concrete, by intuitive physics in young children, I mean the kind of thing that, say, this baby is doing here, this 1.5-year-old, stacking up cups or playing with their toys. Now, we have robots that can do things like pick up objects and do simple kinds of stacking operations. But we don't have any robot that can do what this kid is doing, including the physical dexterity, the ability to sort of solve the little problems that come up along the way when you're trying to achieve your goal. A little bit of debugging going on here. But even just to make the plan, which you can see that this kid is doing, right? Even if you haven't seen this video before, you can see the stack of 3 cups. You can kind of guess where this is going to go if I jump forward into the video, right? To conceive of the goal, to make the plan, if we had robots that could do this, it would be quite amazing, all right? By intuitive psychology, I'll show one very famous video from a very famous study by Felix Wernicke and Michael Tomasello. This is also with a 1.5-year-old, but here the 1.5-year-old is this little kid in the back who's a participant in the experiment. So he is watching an adult, that's Felix, do something that he's never really seen before. I mean, this is a not crazy action, but it's a little bit unfamiliar if you haven't seen this video. And now watch what happens when the adult stops moving. The kid goes over, opens the door. Yeah, yeah. So you guys are totally with me because you smiled and laughed and even awed at all the best parts, right? Somehow that kid is able to figure out what this guy's doing for an action that is not quite like anything he's seen before, and then even figure out how to help him, right? And you can see that helping goes on when he goes over, opens the door, and in some sense, like the best part, both emotionally and I think scientifically, is when he steps back and looks up and makes eye contact, right, at him, and then kind of looks down at his hands. Because what you're seeing when you see that, right, is at least a sign suggestive that the kid has understood what the adult is trying to do and is maybe almost even signaling, like, I think I've understood what you've done. If so, I think I know what you're going to do, which is now do something with your hands.
Okay, so you get the idea. So that just tells you that's right. So we have a long way. The computers have a long way to go to mimic human mind. So we can rest assured with all the fear that we're about. And this was interesting that even though we are common conception that this is a book that I just came across recently as to how we have varieties of myths type of thing. And this is a very well written, easy to read book. We use only 10%. So all these things are basically goofy type of thing. It does not make sense, type thing. So all the false beliefs that are in common public understanding about brain. So this is a neuroscientist from who is been very nice this thing about how varieties of myths, and it goes in a lot more details than what I've summarized type of thing. So okay. All right. And again, the mind extends, the biggest myth that we have, which we want to hopefully dispel in some of it is the mind extends beyond brain and body. Okay, then we'll jump into the things about, and this picture is about Hercules, being confused with temptation versus wisdom type of thing. So this is a painting that goes back to, I think, around 16th century. And again, no talk about memories complete without mentioning the famous London taxi drivers, as to how the exam is. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of you may have seen or heard about it, but it's worth, just for completeness sake, it's worth mentioning as to how the study was done is that posterior hippocampus is larger, but at the cost of the anterior hippocampus, okay? Because, they have to memorize like 320 routes and 25,000 streets, and it takes about 3 to 4 years of training type of thing. And again, this was interesting that those who did well, their brains enlarged compared to those who did poorly. So it proves about the neuroplasticity, but between the so-called spatial and the autobiographical memory type thing. So this is, the classic example of the role of the very specialized region of brain that is specifically, and this has a lot to do with the degenerative processes that we see in Alzheimer's, type of thing, and I think, and we can see that how they cannot form recent memories, but the remote memories, which are more encoded, in the different regions of brain, those are well preserved, but they cannot form new memories. Okay, and again, so these are the basic outlines of varieties of types of memory. We talked about the short-term memory, about the phone numbers, but we all, like it or not, we're limited to 7 numbers type thing. Obviously, there are outliers, people who are, who have phenomenal memory or so-called eidetic memory or photographic memory, as to whatever you want to call it, type thing. But those are, exceptions rather than the rules, And then there are varieties of long-term memories, which are classified into declarative and non-declarative memories, which are again procedural memories, and these sometimes are well preserved even with dementia type thing. So, and I saw that in my own mom who was visiting with us, that she couldn't remember what she ate for breakfast, but to cook, she had absolutely no problem. She knew exactly where the spoons were or where the pots and pans were. So she was able to recall that without any problems, that thing. And then varieties of semantic memories, or the episodic. So there are varieties of ways the psychologists have classified varieties of memories that are formed with either where they're very personal to you or with a general memory as to like what is listed in the encyclopedia type thing. So again, so we talked about, so there, well, we can talk at length about varieties of memories. Okay, Peter's comment was at this point when the child has old people are idiots. Yes, that's absolutely true. Don't trust anyone over 30. That shows from the Planet of Apes, I think I said, don't, that was a Charlton Heston statement, to the younger chimp. Don't trust anyone over 30. So, and I think we all believe that at one time in our life. Okay, but we shall move along. Okay, so these are the varieties of classification of memories type thing. And again, this just shows the long-term memory systems as to gives you classifies as to how procedural memory is different from the so-called semantic memory and the episodic memory. So this just explains to you a lot more details about how memory. But again, at the same time, we have to say that there are something called false memory. And the great neuroscientist, who just passed away a few years ago, Oliver Sacks, talks about false memories that he grew up, during the London Blitz. And obviously, during the Blitz, they were shipped out to the countryside. And he clearly thought, okay, yes, he was there when the bomb landed in his neighbor's yard or a garden, for example. And his brother finally says, "Yeah, you were never there. Okay, you thought you were away, in the countryside." But he just assumed that this was his own personal experience as to how false memories and we have seen that a lot of time in witness identification as to how people have been exonerated based on DNA evidence after 20 years, and the lineups can be okay. So this is again, and the evolution of memory is a very complicated this thing, and varieties of Nobel Prizes have been awarded, and the two well-known people, the one of the Austrian immigrant named Eric Kandel, who had done a lot of work, and on long-term memory potentiation as to how the synapses are formed, and the same way we talked about the Hebbian principle, how to the neurons that fire together, wire together type of thing as to how memory is formed and is encoded in the specialized cells called Purkinje cells in the brains. Okay. And so again, so these are some of the principles as to, and there are very specialized cells, the classical and the master ones, which everybody talks about was the so-called pyramidal neuron cells. But again, at the same time, there are a lot more different types of cells which we are coming to learn and have a lot more role to play. They were considered on the side, the so-called astrocytes and the glial cells, but we're learning now more and more that the other cells are equally important. For example, the glial cells have a lot to do with cleaning out the garbage in the brain at nighttime when you sleep, and they have a lot to do with the denatured proteins that form the so-called uh, uh, in Alzheimer's disease, and which cause the clumping together of the misfolded proteins. So that have a lot to do with it, and so it shows the importance of sleep, in terms of preserving our memories and keeping our brain healthy, so to speak. Again, and the number of receptors, we've gone a lot more way. There are about 50 neurotransmitters that have been isolated, and the importance of varieties of other cells is coming to the forefront. So-called interneurons and the astrocytes and the glial cells have been re-emphasized. And it's an interesting thing. This is just to talk about the other animals as to how, the collaboration of so-called regenerative medicine as well as the memory. And this is almost, futuristic or mind-boggling. The small organism called planaria, as to how if head has been cut off, it can regenerate, and not only can regenerate the hair, the head, but it can also have the same memories that is encoded, is preserved. So as to how the memory is stored outside the head is imprinted on regenerative brain. So that is where the bioelectricity and the intracellular communication comes into this. So a lot of the work that is being done, by by the scientist that I talked about called Michael Levine, and it will have a role in regenerative medicine along with overplay of stem cells. Okay, so that is some very futuristic science that is being talk about, as to how the mind, memory, and bioelectricity are coming into collaboration. So, okay, all right. And okay, let's see where we are. Okay, yeah, I think we're moving right along. Okay, and importantly, there are again specialized cells we talked about, and the 2014 Nobel Prize was given to a husband and wife couple, along with other people, about localizing something called the place and greet cells. And this is, I don't want to spend too much time, but these are some of the excellent videos by a guy who is Russian as to how your brain organizes information.
This is one example of an experiment conducted in 1930s by an American psychologist, Edward Tolman, which led him to coin the term cognitive map, relating to this idea that animals have something like a mental map of surrounding space. However, it wasn't until 40 years later that neuroscientists were able to peek inside the brain to see how such a map is manifested in neural activity. Although cognitive maps serve as a general-purpose representations of the world, as we'll see further, historically they were usually studied in the context of spatial behavior. The predominant view is that the workhorse of cognitive mapping in the mammalian brain is the hippocampal formation, which includes the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure, and entorhinal cortex, which serves as a kind of gateway through which information flows in and out of the hippocampus. What's fascinating about these structures is the existence of spatially selective neurons, which paved the way to understanding how knowledge is organized into a map-like structure at the level of single cells. Let's briefly review the
Okay, so this is, obviously it's a long video, but I'll be happy to send it out, to those of you who have interest. But again, this boils down to the interaction, because information, and the computer science people have, their basis of this thing is information. So how the brain and information are overlapping. Similarly, he has a similar video about the
location specificity. And we still refer to them as place cells in studies on spatial navigation. But as it turns out, they can directly represent non-spatial information as well. Let's consider the following landmark experiment. Rats were trained in a sound manipulation task. They were first presented with the sound of a particular frequency. And to get the reward, the rat had to move the joystick, which varied the frequency of a tone produced by a speaker. Basically, they had to make the frequency match the frequency of a sound they heard at the start. As you might have guessed by now, the investigators recorded the activity of pyramidal neurons in the hippocampus, the same type of cell that usually has a specificity to physical location. And here's the kicker. As the animal was varying the frequency, neurons seemed to have a preferred frequency, around which they had high pyrene rates, and showed almost no activity when the sound produced was in a drastically different range of frequencies. They behaved in exactly the same fashion as conventional place cells behave during foraging, having a well-defined place fields. It's as if the rat was mentally navigating in this acoustic space of sounds to find the desired frequency. In that analogy, the activity of a neuron is that of a typical place cell. It's just this space is more abstract. It's not physical location. What it tells us is...
Okay, so you get the idea. So this is how the location was. So you have a built-in GPS, that Mother Nature has evolved over billions of years. So this was obviously the work worthwhile, or recognized by, got the nod from Nobel Prize. Okay, and so this represents, and this again, this is a very complex, it gets into their very advanced mathematics, or something called graph theory, which I will not try to even get into any details about the so-called nodes and edges, and that's how the mental maps are formed. So
major types of such map-building neurons. The hallmark of hippocampus location specific. This is one example of an experiment conducted in 1930s by an American psychologist, Edward Tolman.
Okay, so this is, now, then again, now a word or two about language type of thing, as to cognition and language are sorely interconnected. Then now the language obviously is a different meaning for computer science people, and math people type thing, because their language understanding is totally different, as to with the programming languages type of thing. And I got mistaken by, says, oh, I'm learning a new language. My son told me, says, oh, okay, so what language? Yes, French, German? No, I think he meant Python. Okay, so that's where, how the word have different meanings for different disciplines, And again, that, well, Bruce will talk a lot more about the language model type of thing as to how did this language arise, that it has a lot more older origin than we realize type of thing. Okay. And again, we evolved from basically grunt, or making various sounds, to later development of syntax, and to later development of various metaphors, as to how it just exploded evaluatively from sign language. And again, the early exposure is a dramatically important type of thing as to how, it was an example of a so-called wild boy of everyone. He was a kid who was isolated and grew up with animals in France. And even though he was found at the age of 12, he could never master language. And again, in one of my earlier classes, we talked about the Romanian infants, who were kept in without any human contact or speech, and they had difficulty, serious speech deformity. So the early formative development of language is dramatically important. And again, people, the kids who grew up with bilingual exposure, they have a different processing on both sides of the brain type thing, because, so well, we'll talk about the localization that I alluded to a little while ago about Broca's area type thing. So again, and the varieties of sign languages have totally evolved in varieties of deaf communities. And similarly, there is a different sign language that evolved in Bedouin Arabs as well. And so that's a totally spontaneous development that has took place type thing. So, and now again, why is it so unique? Okay, all right, because now it turns out that the research that was done in apes, that they have the vocal cord apparatus, as to make sounds, physically. But unfortunately, they just did not get the enough mutation in their brain, in the midbrain area type of thing, to develop true speech. So people have tried varieties of way of teaching sign language to apes, but that efforts have not been, obviously there was the one example of the Coco, the chimp that, learned about after several years of attempts about her, but didn't proceed any further, while a human baby, just picks up within a couple of years type of thing. So, okay. And now again, this was, okay. And there's one of the books that talked about how, the language models develop type of thing as to how, and this was, just like Dave was talking about before we started, as to how the Chat GPT. So I did my own experiment. That in one of the books that I just read, that there was a statement that was formed. Okay, let's just say, give a statement to the computers. You remember that guy we met in New York while at a cocktail party, or the other day, who told us that if the Fed does not ease money supply, the market will crash. So I asked ChatGPT to write a story in New York Times style, on this, and it just formed this thing within less than 20 seconds. It formed the whole essay on it. Now again, getting back to the basic neuroscience, so we went from grooming to gossip, and so these are the classic areas, that all of you who took Anatomy 101, would recognize the so-called Broca's area, which produced speech, while the Wernicke's area, and this was devised based on the patients who had, back in the late 19th century, the physicians, or the neurologists who had the patients who had a stroke in that particular region. And Paul Broca's patient, who could only say one word, tan, on autopsy, he saw the area which was damaged, and that was a localization of speech that occurred, as to how we, and another patient, named Lazarus Lelong, who could only say 5 words in French, we, no, try, and Lilo. So this was and the Wernicke's area has problem with comprehension, type thing. So, okay, and again, where the people who have grown up with two languages have a different processing abilities type thing. So, okay, and so this was again basically how we learn from our patients. That's the important point of the test, I think so. And again, this is just to as to how the emotion. This is a more detailed example of the amygdala. This is the almond-shaped organ, which had a lot to do with, and the hippocampus. So they just illustrate the anatomy in a lot more details. Okay. And again, this was, I talked it last time around about the different areas, about the French cry versus example, as to how the processing in different languages evolved, type thing. So this was mind blowing as to how different languages have different processing abilities, type of thing. And again, we thought, language was, much more exclusively human, but some dolphins and birds and whales have some type of early linguistic skills, type thing. So, okay. And again, last time I mentioned briefly about the evolvement of gene, which is the so-called FOXP2 gene, which if they have abnormalities of that particular gene, the linguistic skills would never develop. So again, goes down to the basics of our genetic code as to how the genes have a lot more influence. And so, and as we are learning about more and more isolation, as to where we are finding out the role of genes affecting our behavior along with culture. Okay, so the complex interplay that we are playing out, part of, again, okay, now getting back to the things about free will. Okay, now again, you're going to find different arguments about the so-called libertarian principle. People believe that we have total free will versus the so-called determinist, as to the controversy that has been going on from the philosophical times, type of thing. Okay, and the free will is the capacity of the person to consciously to decide between varieties of action, okay, without an influence from outside world, and making choices. Okay, now again, the modern view is that this is predetermined. We're predisposed to think the way we are due to our biology, neurochemistry, which are all unique to you, okay, type of thing. So, and so the general consensus among the more modern school of thinking, that free will as we think does not exist. At the same time, the myth that we said that, okay, yes, we still, no matter what free will is, we are determined to have it, so to speak, Okay, so the idea about presence of free will, okay, and obviously some of you may be aware of the classical experiment that a psychologist named Benjamin Libet did, as to how he did the EEG brain mapping with the intention of moving your finger, okay, and the brain the activity in the motor cortex had become almost like 200 or 300 milliseconds before the finger started to move. So again, that showed now that the free will, as we think that we decide, the brain has already decided that you're going to do, type thing. Now, okay, and again, Benjamin Levitt, after his own research was, and this experiment was, he had a hard time believing it himself, and he kind of tried to go back on the idea that yes, this could have been stopped if he had entered to, so like, he was would be able to inhibit the motion, type of thing. But this experiment has been duplicated numerous times, and so this activity occurs in the prefrontal or parietal cortex as many as 700, 500 milliseconds before the subject becomes aware of the decision. So we can say that although we may think we are in control, now whether we'll be able to inhibit the action, now this is a lot more implication in terms of crime and punishment that we talked about. That if your brain made you decide, are you still guilty of it? And the classic example of I think I may be repeating myself, that the guy who shot people from the one of the which was in Texas A&M University. He shot a bunch of people that he had asked for autopsy, and yes, and indeed he was, when he was after he was put to death, okay, and he indeed had a small brain tumor, okay, which affected his behavior. So again, it shows the anatomical and physiological correlate of our actions. Okay, and now these are she's a very well respected scientist.
Free will is one of those psychological categories that Paul thought a lot about. And it turns out that people have very different ideas about what it would be to have free will. Now, if you ask just regular folks, farmers and fishermen and carpenters and so on, they say, well, if you freely made a decision, then you intended to do what you did, and you knew what you were doing, and you could have done otherwise. And then there are other people who say, no. If you made a decision or a choice and it was free, there had to be no causes of that choice. You mean nobody forced me? No, they say. No causes even within your own brain. So this has made for a lot of confusion, because then people wanted to say, well, in that causal vacuum sense, there probably is no such thing as free will because the brain is a causal machine. However, in the other sense of intending and making a decision and suppressing other possibilities, of course that's real. And to separate out all of that, it seems like a very good way to do it is to think that what we should be talking about maybe isn't free will at all, because it just causes all these linguistic problems. Maybe the really fruitful and rewarding concept is the notion of self-control. And there we do have an idea of particular brain regions, very ancient some of them, very much newer others of them, that cooperate and interact in order to suppress certain impulses that would be unproductive, for example, to be able to defer gratification, that is, to forego an immediate reward in order to get a bigger, better, later reward.
Okay, so I think I'll stop it at that thing, but you just get the general idea. And this goes back to the childhood things about how the self-control is, that in children, this is known as the so-called marshmallow test, as to like how if you wait for X number of minutes, you could get 2. And the kids who had the self-control did better at a later age. So this is, the psychological experiment, something called the marshmallow test. So there are varieties of ways, and this is, again, we talked about the earlier slide, talked about the so-called determinism versus free will. And then that is classified as so-called hard determinism versus soft determinism type thing. So this is how free will has, okay. And again, this is, my favorite scientist named Robert Sapolsky, who is a neurobiologist at Stanford, and he has a series of lectures and a recent book called Behave. That was one of the bestsellers, which is unusual for a nonfiction book. And again, you don't have free will type of thing. So again, but I, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to play it but I'll just send it out to those of you who are interested. Okay.
And you could find the neurons in what are called the premotor cortex,
Okay.
which sent signals which triggered that motor cortex.
Yeah, so you get the idea type of thing. But he again has the same principle as Patricia Church
to send that signal.
Okay.
And you could then find neurons in.
Okay.
What?
Yeah, let me go back because it just gave the video. Now, and just to say, because Joan and we have talked about neuroplasticity, just thought I'll throw in at least a word of, and this just almost floored me type of thing, because obviously a very popular book written by a neuroscientist named Norman Doidge about neuroplasticity. I think it's about a 5 or 7 year or 8-year-old book type of thing. It talks about how, even after stroke, the brain recovers a lot of the functionality, and and how the brain, and the classic example is of Helen Keller, and as to how the neuroplasticity evolves and the varieties of thinking about the hearing west, and a lot of the experiments were done in people who are blind, type thing about. But this is about a lot more dramatic example. This is a 44-year-old of a man in France who presented with some leg weakness, and he had hydrocephalus, and he'd undergone a shunt, okay, when he was 14 years old. And he developed, he'd resolved, after shunt revision. And where otherwise he was normal, he was married, was father of 2 children, but you can see how small amount of cortex he was left with. All these things was, his brain, the ventricles had expanded dramatically. And so he was just left with a small rim of cortex, basically. And he was still able to function, work as a civil servant, and he was married, was able to run his family life, and his IQ was tested, and he was like 84, which is in the average range. But you can just see how the amount of neuroplasticity as to the point, varieties of trauma that he was able to tolerate. Okay, and that's just mind blowing. And I already alluded to about how a woman in China was diagnosed. She had absolutely so-called agenesis of cerebellum. Okay, means the small part, but she still did not have much difficulty with her balance. Which you could just see that how simple. If you get damage to the cerebellum from excessive alcohol, you develop severe ataxia. But it just shows us to how the neuroplasticity, makes up for the just massive amount of deficit. Okay, and again, this, I think I'm not going to get too much into the philosophical aspects about it, about the rise of self and non-self, type of thing, Okay, and the German philosopher named Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was the founder of basic so-called philosophy of self versus non-self type thing. So, and again, this was put on more solid basis by an English philosopher named Derek Parfit, who classified the self and non-self concept as the so-called ego versus bundle theory. So ego means the continuation of our self, this thing, so-called like the stream of consciousness, versus the bundle theory of self, which is kind of a various sensory input that occurs that type of place, And so this goes back to the idea of Hume's philosophy type thing. So there are 2 ways of classifying the ideas of self versus non-self, And again, it's how even the chimp has put the little dot on it, so as the identification of it tries to rub it off. So this is the classic example as to how it's not just a uniquely human phenomenon about self versus non-self. And the same phenomena that continues in elephants, magpies, whales, and dolphins, as I alluded to earlier. But poor gorillas, they don't have it, nor do the rhesus monkeys, they don't have it type thing. So, okay. And this has a lot to do with our prefrontal cortex that we alluded to earlier, and that is damaged in schizophrenia or narcissistic philosophies type of thing, so that they lose the identity of self versus non-self. Okay, and again, this elaborates a lot more, the prefrontal cortex and the varieties of brain region that are involved in, forming the image of self versus non-self. Okay, and again, this rolls down to some of these have a lot to do with the so-called out-of-body experience, that the idea of self is dissolved with varieties of psychedelics. And again, people who have had, stimulation of the temporoparietal region of the brain, they had the so-called out-of-body experiences. Okay, and this has a lot to do with, they report changes, like for example, they feel like they're outside the body and they're floating around type of thing. And so this was, so localized region of depending upon which part of the brain was stimulated, the idea as to whether they're floating about their body type of thing, or so again, so the localization of the so-called out-of-body experience have been well worked out, so to speak. And this again may have something to do with some of the religious experiences as well. Okay, and again, so I'm for sake of time, I'm not going to drive. Okay, and then we'll just jump a little bit into consciousness. So hopefully we'll keep up with the time. What is it like to be you, type of thing, And without consciousness, there is nothing. So this is Christoph Koch, is a well-known, respected scientist who has been working. He started working with Francis Crick, and in San Diego, and now he heads this the well-funded Allen Institute in Seattle. Okay, and yes, then they've done a lot of pioneering work on establishing the so-called neural correlates of consciousness. Okay, and then again that leads us into varieties of isms type of thing as to how consciousness has evolved. Now we talk about the so-called monism that we the materialistic view, dualism that we talk about, idealism, which was the Platonic ideal that we talked about, and the last but not the least is called panpsychism. That means there is consciousness in everything, type thing, including small animals and trees and plants, or even now this stretches out a little bit. That's why it's considered, a little over the top type thing, so-called panpsychism, means that even the non-living objects, which is where I think you and I would draw a line as to say, yeah, that a rock exactly does not have a consciousness, but this is what some of the panpsychism this thing is. So the varieties of isms that we need to address if we're going to talk a little bit about thing, and the panpsychism features, type thing, and it gets into some of the crazy stuff that Deepak Chopra or some of the mysticism people are spouting type thing. So again, this again boils down to the so-called Eastern versus Western philosophy type of thing. Okay, so but rather says, like as most of the neuroscientists, I believe in so-called physicalism type thing, because it ultimately it boils down to the brain type thing. So, and again, why are we interested in studying all this? Because this goes down to it has very dramatic influence. We talked about in the coma or vegetative states, varieties of psychiatric states, and again, and lastly but not the least, with the recent rise of artificial intelligence, that's why it's important to understand, what it is like to be type thing. And this goes down to the founder of psychology, the William James, and who coined the term so-called stream of consciousness, that okay, and that the idea was brought down by, Aldous Huxley later on in the early 20th century, and by the popular group the Doors, who that's how the stream of consciousness, which Aldous Huxley proposed to, and so that ties down with the more recent era type thing. So, and so this was, he proposed the idea of as to how it was continuous type thing, and then again, he was not didn't focus, and this was in the early days of neuroscience, so his repertoires were somewhat limited uh, in terms of, and again, some of you may have heard about, as to how Proust was a new stream of Proustian moment, and this was a very popular book written by a guy named Jonathan Lehrer. And again, how, the Proust classic, he talks about how the memories were related to the small French pastry that he talked about, how the memories of his childhood came gushing back in. That is the classical neuroscientist movement, so it changed the neuroscience. So, and this was a popular book by, In Search of Lost Time, on Marcel Proust classic. And Jonathan Lehrer had written a book about how he was a neuroscientist, which was a good book for, you may remember that from several years ago type thing. Okay. And but I don't think I would ever want to read the book, because or maybe I'll wait until I really retire. Okay. And so again, this is another chart that we can say about how, the consciousness and intelligence, can say that there is a ascending graph that we talks about how the computer science is on this axis, has a dramatic intelligence or lacks consciousness. On the other hand, on the human or animal evolutionary scales, from ants onwards to octopi to monkeys to humans. So you can just see that. Now, some of you may have seen the movie Ex Machina, okay, which is where the human robot, as to how, whether she had consciousness or not, as to what the test who was that it was for the young computer programmer who was invited to stay and meet Ava, or whether who the test was for. So it was an interesting movie as to where the borderline ends between consciousness, robotics, and artificial intelligence. So it goes further than what Hal did. Okay. Again, the interconnectedness of body, you have to emphasize, this is the stress in the brain as to varieties of emotions have a direct bearing on as to what part of the brains, we talked about it in more details earlier as to how the varieties of hormones and chemicals are interconnected as to how we talked about hypothalamus. But again, the interconnectedness of our hormonal axis, starting from the hypothalamus to the varieties of releasing hormones. Okay. Okay. I should call you back. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. So, okay. And how this is, the fight or flight response that all of you are, well aware of type of thing, basically. But so I won't elaborate it. But it is a direct connectivity as to how, if you have too much of cortisol, it could, really affect your mental stats. You could get, your brain could get easily affected type of thing, and you could get almost depressive disorder, manic disorder type thing. So the interconnected of hormones. Okay. Now again, I think we are the nicest video that you can see that if some of you may have seen, Noah had a series just within last year type of thing, okay, about our brain. There were 2 or 3 part series about who's in control, and that may be worth your time type thing. So I put the link inside the chats type of thing as to and the varieties of definitions that we talked about, consciousness is hard to define. But again, when we know, we lose it during general anesthesia or sleep. So it's a very classic example as to how the consciousness is a dynamic phenomenon. Okay, now this, some of you may have seen this, but I just thought it was worthwhile showing, and okay, this is taken from the talk about this Noah's slide, okay, about the so-called dress. As to, you can see the dress is white or gold. Okay, as to how your mind and your vision plays a trick about perception, as to how the processing occurs in a top-down fashion. Okay, so this is, and she has a nice talk about, she's a vision scientist. So these are some of her clips as to how they, and I'm sure you've seen this in a couple of years ago when it became very popular, subject. Okay, let's see who else had. Yes, Peter's comment was right that the mental process is different, and especially for people who are using pictographic languages versus, the standard languages like the Western and Indic language, the Indo-European linguistic group. So the processing is totally different in terms of people who learn the. Okay, all right. Okay, I think we're reaching up to 12 o'clock, and I've covered, about 60 slides, so we probably should think about, okay, and let's stop here at this stage, and we'll continue next week, and then I already alluded to the talk between the elaboration of when Francis Crick got bored with DNA work, he had, and he had obviously enough reputation to work on the neural correlates of consciousness that changed the study of consciousness dramatically, type of thing. So he kind of, gave the impetus to further research on consciousness, because before that, consciousness was considered a taboo for neuroscientists, and nobody actually did much attempt on it. And so, but this was the groundbreaking paper that they published, in the 90s, and then the work took off from that. Okay, and I think, then there are. We should probably stop here because it is after 12, and some of you may have to leave, type of thing. So we'll stop here at this stage, if you wouldn't mind stopping the recording, and then we'll continue next time.